Welcome to Chapter 52, Community Ecology. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to use examples to explain commensalism, competition, consumption, and mutualism. You should be able to explain the importance of the niche concept to ecology, and whether community structure is predictable or unpredictable over time, and why. Describe the factors that affect ecological succession following a disturbance. All right, so just to remind you, a biological community is defined as all of the populations of interacting species within a defined area, okay? So it is multiple species and then the individual populations within each species that can potentially interact in a particular place. So we know that a population, meaning a group of individuals of the same species who have interactions with each other and interbreed, right? So that's a population. The fate of that population is likely to be tightly linked to the other species that are around them in the community, right? So interactions between species in a community can affect the fitness of the individuals involved. So whether an individual lives or dies or how many babies it has is going to be due to, interactions with the community, like predators or parasites or competitors. Okay? So there are four types of interactions that you get between species. The first one is called commensalism. And so this happens when the two species interact and one species benefits from the interaction, but the other species is not affected by the interaction. So we can show that by plus, meaning one species benefits, and 0, meaning the other species doesn't hurt them, doesn't help them. All right, 2 is competition. So this is defined as happening when individuals use the same resources, and the outcome of that is that both populations, individuals of both populations have lower fitness. So that's a minus and a minus. So they're both hurt by the interaction. Consumption happens when you have one organism eating or absorbing nutrients from another, and the outcome of that is that you increase the fitness of the one who does the eating, but you decrease the fitness of the one who gets eaten. So that's a plus and a minus. And then finally, mutualism, and this happens when two species interact in a way in which they both have fitness benefits. So that's a plus and a plus. All right, so let's test this out. So let's say I told you that some birds follow moving swarms of army ants in the tropics. As the ants are marching along the forest floor, hunting insects and small vertebrates, the birds will kind of follow along behind the ants, and the birds will pick off any insects or small vertebrates that fly or jump out of the way of the ants. This situation is an example of what kind of species interaction between the birds and the ants.
Okay, let's think about this. So is the bird eating the ant?
No, I told you the bird's not eating the ant, right? The bird's just hopping around behind the ant, eating the other things that the ants scare.
Okay. Is the bird parasitizing the ant?
No, I just told you the bird is hopping around behind, and it's just eating the stuff the ants are scaring.
Okay. Is the bird cooperating with the ant?
No, I just told you. Fine, it's commensalism. Just stop it, dog. Okay, so the bird is not hurting the ants, but the ants are helping the bird. I think that's the right answer. Do you get it, dog?
Okay, fine. I was just trying to make it more interesting.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about commensalism. It can be really hard to actually find instances of commensalism in nature, mostly because it's like just because of the way that the scientific method works, it's a lot easier to show the presence of an effect than the absence of an effect, right? So we can see, we can measure a positive or a negative effect of one species on another species. However, if we fail to find an effect, it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't any effects, just that the way that we measured it and the particular kind of variable we were looking at, we didn't find an effect. So I should just point that out. It's also important to note that commensalism can be conditional, meaning it depends on the exact conditions in which it occurs. So you may see an epiphyte, like an orchid. So anyone know what an epiphyte is? Yeah, it's like a plant that lives off of the ground on another plant. Yeah. So an orchid would be an epiphyte like this. So you can see it has a specialized kind of root structures just hold onto a tree like this, and so it grows off of the floor of the rainforest usually. And so the epiphyte will always benefit by being able to be up off the ground so it can get access to more sunlight, right? And under normal circumstances, the epiphyte isn't doing anything bad to the tree. Like its roots are very shallow and it's just kind of hanging onto the tree. It's not like digging into the tree, it's not eating things the tree is using, right? It's just stuck to the outside of a tree. And so that's a situation in which you have commensalism. However, if you end up with too many epiphytes, so if the epiphytes are completely coating the tree, then the tree won't be able to photosynthesize, and then potentially you could end up with a competitive interaction where the presence of each species hurts the other species. All right, so that leads us to competition, right? So that's a negative-negative interaction, and it's an interaction in which the fitness of both individuals involved become less. And so, this is basically the two species are competing for resources, and so then the resources aren't available to either species to be able to, forage or mate or do other activities that they need to do in order to increase their fitness. So you can get competition that is intra-specific. So if it's intra, what does that mean?
It means within, like intramural sports.
Yeah. So intraspecific competition is between members of the same species. Okay. And we've talked a little bit about intraspecific competition already, right? So we talked about it when we were talking about density-dependent growth, right? So as a population, as the density of a population increases, individuals start to have negative interactions with each other, and eventually each individual's fitness is lowered enough that the population's growth will level out, and that causes it'll level out at the carrying capacity for that population. Okay. Interspecific competition is competition between species, and so that is when you have two completely different species and they just both happen to need the same resource, and so the members of each species will compete with each other. Okay. So when we think about competition, especially competition between species, we'll often turn to the niche concept. So a niche is defined as the range of resources that a species is able to use or the range of conditions that that species can tolerate. And so when you see interspecific competition, meaning competition between two species, that happens when the niches, or the range of resources that the species can, live on, when the niches of the two species overlap. Okay, so you can see here's species 1 and here's species 2. And these are two different species that feed on seeds, right? And the seeds could be small seeds, medium seeds, or big seeds. So species 1, their niche is here, meaning they can eat seeds that are from a tiny size to, kind of medium, large size. Species 2 can only eat big seeds, so it has to eat seeds that are medium to large, okay? And then the height of the curve is just showing the number of seeds consumed. So, most seeds, the average is around here. This species 1 has more spread to the sizes of seeds they can eat. Species 2 is a little bit more specialized because you can see that they eat a smaller range of sizes. They eat a smaller range of sizes of seeds.
Ha ha! You said something funny!
I don't even know what it was.
Yes, okay.
All right, so when you have symmetric competition between both species, then you have each species experiencing a roughly equal decrease in fitness when they're competing for a resource, right? So each species will suffer the same amount when they compete. In an asymmetrical competition, you have one species that suffers a much greater fitness decline than the other species when it competes, okay? All right, so you sometimes find a situation in which you have two species in competition, and one of them is a better competitor than the other one. So these are two species of paramecium. We talked about them a little bit earlier. I know they're drawn like the same size, but Paramecium caudatum is a really big species of paramecium, and Paramecium aurelia is a small species of paramecium, right? And we looked at these, I think when we looked at logistic growth a while ago, so we already found out that they had different carrying capacities. So when they are housed alone, you can have a lot more P. aurelia in the same sized, kind of bottle than you could have P. caudatum, because again, the caudatum are bigger. All right, so here's the carrying capacity of P. caudatum. Here's the carrying capacity of P. aurelia when they're housed alone. All right, when you grow them together, you find that the P. aurelia has logistic growth, meaning, remember that's the S-shaped where you start out with this J-shaped increase, and then it levels out like this, okay? All right, so P. aurelia had logistic growth, meaning growth that, was S-shaped, and then the other species went extinct, okay? So clearly, P. aurelia is the stronger competitor. These two species had completely overlapping niches, so the ranges of food that they needed to eat were exactly the same, all right? Well, I say not exactly the same. Everything that P. caudatum needed to eat, P. aurelia needed to eat. However, P. aurelia also had the capacity to use a broader range of resources than P. caudatum, right? So when you have a situation like this, in which you have one species' niche completely overlap the other species, we would say that the one with the bigger range is going to be the winner, okay? And so this is the competitive exclusion principle. And this is the idea that it's not possible for two species with exactly the same niche to coexist, okay? So if both species need to eat exactly the same thing, one of the species is going to drive the other species to extinction. But you do find that when the niches of two species do not overlap completely, then the weaker competitor should be able to persist in the area of non-overlap. Like in the previous slide, if you have two curves that have to have a little bit of area overlapping, whichever is the weaker competitor, they should be able to just eat the foods that don't overlap with the stronger competitor. So that's the competitive exclusion principle. Okay, so as we've talked about, what happens when you do get two interactions between two species. So here's species one. This is a strong competitor, and then this is species two. This is a weak competitor. Each of these curves represents the range of resources that each species is capable of using. Okay, so we kind of make a distinction between two ideas of the niche. One is a fundamental niche, and so that's kind of what we were showing in the previous slides. That's the total theoretical range of environmental conditions that a species can tolerate, right? So species one was housed alone. It could use this resource all across this range, right? If species two were alone, it would use resources in this range. Okay. However, if you go and look in nature, you tend to find that species do not occupy their fundamental niche. Instead, they occupy their realized niche. And that's the portion of the fundamental niche that a species actually occupies, given limiting factors like competition with other species. So if we see here, species one is a strong competitor. So species one, this represents the range of resources that species one could tolerate. Species one is able to outcompete species two. So actually, the fundamental niche is the same as the realized niche for species one. Species two, however, is a weaker competitor. So when species one and species two compete for resources that are in this overlapping range from here to here, species one gets them all and species two gets none of them, okay? So as a result, if you see species two in nature, they tend to only eat resources or use resources from here to here, from this range, right? So this colored in area would be the realized niche of species two. And then the fundamental niche is the line, okay? All right, so we know that because competition hurts both species, there is strong natural selection on both species to be able to avoid competition if possible. And so one prediction that you'd have is that if you had two species that started out overlapping in their niches, there would be selection for the traits to avoid this overlap. And I should point out, it's not that the individuals are showing up in an area, seeing the other species, and deciding themselves individually to change, but instead, the individuals that tend to use resources that are in this intermediate range have low fitness, and they just don't have as many babies, right? And if this trait is heritable, then those individuals don't pass on their genes. The individuals who are able to use, the individuals of species two who are able to use these resources survive. The individuals of species one who use these resources survive. So as a result, there is selection for species one individuals that use resources in this range, and species two individuals that use resources in this range. And so you see over time that species one will use a different range of resources than species 2, okay? And so this change in resource use is called niche differentiation or resource partitioning. These are two names for it. So differentiation meaning causing a difference, right, between the two niches, or the term resource partitioning just refers to the fact that the resources have been partitioned between the two species. All right. So if you actually look at the traits that the species have, right? So maybe it's something like beak size or body size or leg length, right? If you end up having a change over long periods of time in this trait, this is called character displacement. So the beak size, for example, has been displaced, or the leg size has been displaced from its original size to being larger or smaller than the original size. And so this kind of character displacement makes it possible for species to be able to use different resources, and it also makes niche differentiation possible, okay? So just to reiterate, niche differentiation refers to the fact that the two species are now using different resources, and then character displacement refers to the fact that the traits of the individuals have become different over evolutionary time. So here's an example. We're back to our favorite finches.
Yay, I love the finches!
Oh, I'm glad you love the finches, bird. So remember, in the Galapagos Islands, there's an island named Daphne Major, and in Daphne Major, you would find that the medium ground finch, Zoospiza fortis, has medium-sized beak. If you look at nearby Santa Cruz Island, Geospiza fortis here they are, in green again, have bigger beaks, right? So this is the beak depth. So the average is here on Daphne Major, but over here on Santa Cruz, okay? And what you find on Santa Cruz Island is that, unlike in Daphne Major, Geospiza fortis lives with Geospiza fulginosa, okay? So it looks like there has been niche differentiation, right? So they have started feeding on different foods in the two places, and that has caused character displacement, meaning the depth of the beaks is different between the two species. So let's test that, right? So the people who do research on this system wanted to know whether competition caused character displacement in Geospiza fortis, or was it something else, like predation or food availability, right? So let's test the hypothesis that there was character displacement. All right, so in 1982, the large ground finch, Geospiza magnirostris, which just means big nose, arrived in Daphne Major. Okay, so there he is. Look at the size of that beak.
Wow, that's an impressive beak.
Yeah. So now it is sympatric with Geospiza fortis, right? And so at the time, there were individuals of Geospiza fortis who had small beaks ranging to large beaks, okay? One advantage that Geospiza magnirostris had was that it can use that big old beak to open these big drought-resistant seeds. And what we find is that after 1982, when Geospiza magnirostris arrived on the island, then Geospiza fortis average beak size slowly decreased over generations, right? So it's not that every single bird is having a smaller beak. Instead, it's that these big-beaked Geospiza fortis have started to disappear, and so the average beak size for the population is smaller. All right, so in 2004, there was a severe drought, and most of the finches starved. And what you found is that the Geospiza fortis that could eat small seeds survived, but any of the Geospiza fortis with larger beaks ended up getting chased away from the feeding sites by the big Geospiza magnirostris. So as a result, you lost the rest of the intermediate-sized beaked Geospiza fortis, leaving only the small-beaked ones. So natural selection favored the Geospiza fortis individuals that did not compete with Geospiza magnirostris. So we can see here there was directional selection on Geospiza fortis beak size that led to character displacements. And so the two niches did differentiate. So this kind of supports the hypothesis that on the other island, you ended up with a similar pattern happening. All right.
That was a pretty sad story.
Well, I mean, it's only sad for the Geospiza fortis with medium-sized beaks. It's happy for everyone else.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, so which species is a stronger competitor?
Oh, it's definitely species 1.
All right, so explain why.
Because, like, it can eat everything species 2 can eat and some more things. So species 2 is just going to get outcompeted and die.
That's pretty much it. All right, so consumption is the third kind of interaction. That's a plus-minus interaction that occurs. Oops, no, that's the fourth kind of interaction, sorry. That occurs when one organism eats one another. There are three major types of consumption. We talk about herbivory, and that means eating plant or algal tissue by herbivores. We talk about predation, and so that's killing or consuming most or all of another individual by a predator. So usually we are referring to carnivores when we're talking about predation, but if you're a person who studies plants, you will refer to consumption of plants as predation too, okay? So just keep that in mind. And parasitism is another kind of consumption. So that's a consumption of small amounts of tissues by another organism or a parasite. So there's different kinds of parasites. There are endoparasites that live inside a host's body. There are ectoparasites that live on the outside of the host's body. And then there's a third kind of a parasite called a parasitoid. And this is a parasite that actually ends up killing the host.
Oh no, that's terrible.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. So parasitoids tend to be free-living as adults, but have endoparasitic larvae. So they'll start out putting their babies inside a host, and then the babies will usually kill the host as they leave.
That's a terrible, sad story.
All right, give it an example of each. What's an herbivore?
A cow!
What's a predator?
Me!
What are you?
A dog.
What's an ectoparasite?
Fleas!
What's an endoparasite?
Oh, a tapeworm!
What's a parasitoid?
I definitely don't know.
Oh, I know. Like those little wasps that put their eggs in caterpillars, or the flies that put their babies in crickets. Yep, you guys got them all. All right, let's talk a little bit about defenses against being eaten. So we call these constitutive defenses. Well, there's a couple kinds, but there's constitutive defenses. And so this is traits that allow individuals to avoid being eaten. So constitutive defenses are a kind of defense that is always present, okay? So you can't turn it on and off, it's on all the time. So it could be something like cryptic coloration to blend in with your background, fancy escape behaviors like this lizard that can run across water. Fish have this cool behavior called a sea start behavior where they bend over and then flick away. Remember that jump back behavior in the kangaroo rat, right? Toxins and other defensive chemicals are made for avoiding predators, different kinds of schooling behaviors that fish do in order to avoid predation, and things like defensive armor and weapons, like this rose. So one kind of a constitutive defense is mimicry, and so that is basically mimicking another species. There are two kinds of mimicry. One kind is called Batesian mimicry, and that's when non-toxic prey species resemble dangerous prey species. Okay, so this is when you have a non-toxic individual or non-toxic species imitating a toxic species. So in this case, the mimic benefits from the mimicry, right? The toxic species doesn't really benefit from the non-toxic species doing the kind of mimicry. This is different than Mullerian mimicry, and this is when you have two or more harmful prey species that resemble each other and both species benefit. So the benefit to multiple species is that, for example, a predator, when you have things like paper wasps, bumblebees, and honeybees, they all have this black and white coloration, right? Or black and yellow coloration. And this is something that is fairly easy for a predator to be able to see. So a bird can see it, a dog can see it, right? And so this is a signal that the predator learns, don't eat this kind of an organism, it will hurt you, right? And so if like a bird tries to eat a paper wasp, it'll avoid a bumblebee and a honeybee in the future, right? Okay, so it's beneficial to all of the different species that look harmful, because once a predator learns not to eat one of them, it won't eat any of them. Batesian mimics, like a hornet moth, a wasp beetle, and a hoverfly. So this is kind of a fly, so it's got no stinger. This is a beetle, got no stinger. This is a moth, no stinger, right? So it's kind of like drafting on the thing that the predator learned by biting one of these guys. And so then the predator will not only avoid the wasp or the bee, it'll also avoid anything that looks like the wasp or the bee. So the mimic benefits from the deception. It might be slightly bad for the toxic species because, for example, it might make it harder for a predator to learn to avoid these patterns if sometimes when it eats these bugs, nothing bad happens to the predator. All right. If you have this kind of plus-minus relationship of consumption, you can cause all sorts of unexpected and interesting consequences to the other species in a community. And so you can end up with mutualisms, commensalisms, and other types of interactions amongst prey species as the prey species try to avoid being eaten by a predator. All right, so I talked about constitutive defenses a minute ago. What's a constitutive defense?
That's a defense that you got all the time.
Yeah. So an inducible defense is a defense that you only put on when you need it, okay? So a constitutive defense causes you to use lots of energy to be able to maintain and produce that kind of a defensive mechanism. An inducible defense, you only have to put it on when you need it, okay? So these are physical, chemical, or behavioral traits produced in response to the presence of a predator. And so inducible defenses are much more efficient energetically, but sometimes they can be slow. It might take a little while to be able to set up the defense. So here is a question regarding an inducible defense. So the question is, are mussel defenses induced by the presence of crabs? So the hypothesis is that mussels will increase investment in defense in the presence of crabs. The null is that the mussels do not increase investment in defense in the presence of crabs. So they took these tanks, so these are flow tanks, so water flows in one side and out the other, just continuously. So there's lots of tanks, but the tanks are of one of two kinds. Either there's a tank here that's empty, and it flows into a tank full of mussels, or there's a tank over here that has a crab in it. The crab has been fed fish, and then the water goes in with the mussels, so the mussels can smell the smell of the crab, okay? So their prediction is that mussels downstream of the crab tank are going to end up with thicker shells than mussels downstream of the empty tank. The prediction for the null hypothesis is that the mussels in the two tanks will have shells of equal thickness. All right, so look at this graph here. What result did they find?
Yeah, well, it looks like the mussels that were like downstream from the crabs had thicker shells than the other ones.
Yeah. So the mussels that lived downstream from a crab and had crab smell, which would suggest to them, watch out, there's predators around, develop thicker shells. So the conclusion is that mussels will increase investment in defense when they detect crabs, and so we can conclude that the thickness of the shell of the mussels is an inducible defense that, it's a defense that they can induce in the presence of a predator. All right, another thing that you can find when you have long-term relationships between predators and prey are coevolutionary arms races. And so when you have a consumer and a prey interact over time, you can get this repeating cycle of reciprocal adaptation. So first the consumer is going to evolve traits that increase their efficiency in catching the prey item, and then in response the prey item will evolve traits that make them either not tasty or to avoid the predation. And then selection favors consumer traits that counter the prey adaptation, on and on and on. So for example, if you start out with a crab as the natural predator of a snail, the natural selection is going to favor the snail to end up with a thicker shell and spines, right? Because the snails with thin shells and no spines die. Okay, now that you have thicker shells and spines, then the crabs will evolve more powerful claws that can pierce the thick and spiny shells, right? And then you get thicker and spinier shells and bigger claws and even bigger claws and even thicker, spinier shells. So you have this coevolution back and forth between the predator species and the prey species. So you often find that coevolution drives evolutionary change. And it isn't just an issue that you see in predator-prey items. You can also find it in other contexts. So you can find coevolution between, for example, a host and a parasite, or between two competitors. All right, this is the mutable rain frog. It has lovely smooth skin
Oh yeah, real nice.
until it's disturbed. So when it senses danger, it grows spines that would make it less likely to be eaten. So what kind of a defense would that be?
That's inducible.
Yeah, that's inducible. And it's not just the mutable rain frog that has this. I just recall that when I took a class on salamanders, we found out that there's a salamander. So most salamanders have a kind of a poison in their skin, and the poison won't hurt you unless you actually it actually gets into your bloodstream, right? And so some of them have sharpened ribs. So if you grab the salamander, it will use its own ribs to pierce its skin, and then that will inject its toxin directly into the host grabbing it.
That's terrible. Why did you tell me that story? I will have nightmares.
Okay, just don't eat salamanders.
That's a real hard ask.
Excuse me. All right, so mutualisms are plus-plus interactions, and they can be very diverse in terms of the kinds of rewards that organisms get. So you get mutualisms between flowering plants and their pollinators. So the plant gets pollinated, and the pollinator will usually get some kind of a nectar as a reward. You have interactions between mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots, which we talked about. Do you guys remember what that is?
Yeah, that's when you have those bacteria that live in the ground.
No, it's mycorrhizal fungi.
Oh, you get fungi that live in the ground, and it goes into the root of the plant, and it helps the plant fix nitrogen and stuff.
Yeah. You also have bacteria.
Oh, that's the one. Okay, I was thinking of that one.
Yeah, we also found bacteria that fix nitrogen. And let's see. We have cleaner shrimp and fish, so everyone loves that, right?
Why doesn't he eat the shrimp?
Well, I'm not sure why he doesn't eat the shrimp, but I guess it's probably more beneficial to to the fish, to keep his mouth open and let the shrimp eat the little food that's between his teeth, because the fish can't get food out from between their teeth.
I can't either.
Yeah, I know, dog. That's why I brush your teeth for you.
I don't like that either. Where's my cleaner shrimp?
I think I'm your cleaner shrimp.
Oh.
It should be pointed out, so we talked about the evolution of altruism in the lecture on animal behavior. When you have mutualists that are interacting with each other, they are not trying to be quote-unquote nice. Mutualisms are not altruistic, so the benefit of mutualism has to be a byproduct of each individual pursuing their own interests, right? So both partners in the mutualism have to be maximizing their fitness, or this trait would not persist over time. And so you can see, if you need evidence that mutualisms aren't individuals being nice to each other, that there's rampant examples of species cheating their mutualistic partners. So sometimes you have plants that have these really showy flowers but don't make any nectar. So pollinators will come to these beautiful flowers and they think they're getting some nectar, but they don't get any nectar. As a result, pollinators don't get any reward for pollinating these plants. If you look on the other side, you find pollinators that are nectar robbers. So the way that pollination works is the insect has to kind of climb into the top of the flower to get the pollen all over its body to carry the pollen somewhere else, right? But if the insect, instead of going through the top of the flower, just makes a little hole in the side of the flower and eats the nectar, it's getting the nectar without pollinating. So in those cases, you end up with what started out as a plus-plus interaction, meaning a pollinator and a plant, and that becomes a plus-minus interaction in which only one of the two partners is benefiting. All right, so we've been talking about consumption, and you can have multiple consumption interactions linked together in what we call a food chain. And multiple food chains can be linked together to form a food web, and that's a kind of a picture that summarizes the consumptive interactions in a community.
Wait, why does the arrow point towards the thing that's eating the thing?
That is just the way that we draw food chains. So it's kind of showing the direction that the energy is flowing, right? So the arrow always points towards the thing that's eating the other thing.
Okay, whatever.
So some species will have a disproportionate influence on the diversity and abundance of other species in the community. And so we have two kinds of influential species. Some kinds of species will have a bottom-up effect on community structure, and others will have a top-down effect on community structure. So a bottom-up influence might be something like an effect on a primary producer. So you could have abiotic factors like temperature and sunlight and humidity that influence the abundance of the primary producers. And then the primary producers are influencing the rest of the community. So that's bottom-up control. You can also have species, so the species at the bottom of the food web can also have a major effect on community structure. So if you look at something like a kelp forest, the algae that represent the forest provide a place for everything else to live. So they become very, very important. If they're not there, then there's no places for anything else to live, and so they are the most important part of the community. Similarly, in a redwood forest, the redwood trees themselves are the basis of the forest, and so if you don't have the trees, you don't have the forest. So you can think of these primary producers, like the kelp and the redwoods, as ecosystem engineers, meaning that they're providing the actual physical space for the other organisms to live in the habitat. So if you remove ecosystem engineers, this causes the community to basically crash, right? So you can't have a kelp forest without a kelp. All right, sometimes, instead of being a bottom-up influenced community, you have top-down influences on community structure. So sometimes you have particular players in the community that make a big difference. In one of these classic experiments of tide pool communities, where you have a top predator of a sea star, Pisaster ochraceus, researchers removed Pisaster from particular plots of area and found that the mussels ended up taking over the entire community, and they changed the rest of the community structure. And so we would call Pisaster a keystone species. So it's a species that has a much greater impact on the distribution and abundance of the surrounding species than would be suggested just by the total number of sea stars there are, or the total mass of sea stars that there are in the community. And so when you have a consumer like a sea star limiting prey populations, we call that top-down control. And so, for example, blue crabs have top-down control on salt marshes, right? So they keep everything else in check. In kelp forests, otters have top-down control. So if otters aren't there eating sea urchins will basically eat all of the kelp. Oh, I put this picture in. Have you heard of a keystone species before?
No, never.
Okay, do you know what a keystone is?
Is it a stone that looks like a key?
No, it is when you look at the archways of buildings.
Dogs can't look up.
That is totally not true. You'll see that there's this wedge-shaped stone, right, that's in the middle. And so the way that they build these stone arches is they put a form in, like a little semicircular form, and just stack the stones in there, right? But it's that stone right in the middle that keeps these stones in place. And so once you put this keystone in the middle, you can remove the arch form, and the arch of stones will stay in place. Okay, let's talk about disturbance. So a disturbance is any strong, short-lived disruption to a community that results in the distribution, that changes the distribution of the living and the non-living resources in that community. And so there are three factors that will determine the impact of a particular disturbance. First of all, what kind of disturbance is it? What you got? Volcano, fire, whatever. How frequently does the disturbance happen? And how severe was the disturbance? So in most cases, when you have a disturbance, it tends to be a disturbance that happens with some kind of predictable frequency and severity. Okay, so maybe you have a 100-year flood, or every 10 years a fire, okay? And so this particular pattern is called the disturbance regime for a community. It's just how frequently you are likely to have a disturbance in a particular community. So after a disturbance, you have what's called succession.
Succession? I love that show.
Okay, but this is not related to that, except, I mean, that they both mean one thing succeeds another thing.
Okay.
So succession is the development of communities after a disturbance, okay? So succession basically refers to the recovery from a disturbance. So there are two parts to a succession. The primary succession occurs, well, let me put it this way. A disturbance doesn't always require primary succession, but primary succession refers to the fact that the disturbance has removed completely the soil and all of the organisms in the soil, as well as all of the organisms that live above the soil surface. So if you have something like a volcano in which lava covers everything and there's no soil present at all afterwards, you would need to have primary succession that happened first, okay? Secondary succession occurs when a disturbance removes some or all of the organisms from an area, but the soil is still there. So the seeds and the microorganisms are still there. So if you have a fire, for example, it might burn everything at the surface, but you still got your soil and all the seeds that are inside the soil, okay? So after a volcano, you would first have primary succession and then secondary succession. After a fire, you have soil, so you just have secondary succession happening. All right, so let's talk through the process about recovery. So let's just say you had a volcanic eruption, and after the eruption, everything is burned up. There's no animals, no plants, and no soil. Ah! Well, okay, calm down. This didn't happen here. You're okay.
I don't like thinking about that.
Okay, just close your ears for a few minutes. So after the volcanic eruption, there's no soil, right? And so nothing can grow, nothing can live there. And then over long periods of time, the rocks will be exposed to, weather, right? And waves and things like that. And so that will start to produce gravel, sand, silt, and clay. And then organisms will begin to colonize the substrate. And so they will add things like dead cells, tissues, and feces to the ecosystem. So as you get sand, silt, and clay, you may have little microorganisms coming in. You could have birds pooping on the, let's say it's a completely naked island with nothing in it. You could have birds pooping on that. You could have dead material like plants and stuff washing up on shore or falling on it. Leaves could blow in, the leaves will decompose. Okay, eventually soil forms from these organic and inorganic particles. Once you get soil, then if a seed lands there, the plant can grow and add structure to the landscape. If you did not happen to have all the soil destroyed by the disturbance, then you just start at the secondary succession phase, right? So during secondary succession, the soil's already there. So it's much easier to recover if you only need secondary succession and not both primary and secondary succession. All right, so what happens during secondary succession is that first you get pioneering species, and so these are kind of weeds and other things like that. Weeds are usually species that are really able to colonize new places and grow very quickly. Then you get early successional community. So the weedy species become replaced by these longer-lived herbaceous species like this, these kind of low-growing plants. Then you have mid-successional community. So the shrubs and short-lived trees will begin to invade and they will take over, and that will not make a suitable habitat for the early successional community, so that will start to disappear as it's outcompeted for light by these shrubs. And then finally, you end up with a climax community, and you have long-lived tree species that mature, and as these species mature, they do block out the sun, and they become the dominant plant. Let's give an example of succession in Glacier Bay, Alaska. So as the glaciers have started to recede, we have new available territory where plants can grow. So that's a good place for studying succession. So if you look at areas in which the glacier receded less than 20 years ago, you can see that what they have are just kind of scattered vegetation, so these little herbaceous plants, right? If you look at areas that were deglaciated 100 years ago, they have these thickets of shrubs and scattered trees, so kind of low-lying woody plants. And then if you look at the oldest sites, they have dense spruce and hemlock forests, so they have these tall trees. So the original hypothesis was that Glacier Bay was following a single successional pathway. As the glacier receded, first you get little herbaceous shrubs, then you get, little herbaceous plants, then you get short shrubs, then you get tall trees, okay? So people looked at the successional pathways in 3 different areas in Glacier Bay. And what they found is that in different areas of the bay, you get different successional pathways. So if you look at this lower bay area over here, you find that spruce trees gave way to hemlock trees. In Middle Bay, you find that alder thickets gave way to spruce, and then in Upper Bay, alder thickets gave way to cottonwoods. And so you end up finding that there are 3 different successional pathways that are generated by, first of all, what species got to that particular area, what traits the species have that allow them to survive in that particular area, what kind of interactions those species have with other species, etc. The historical part means like which species happen to land in that area, okay? So you find the same pattern of succession, but different species are found representing each of the different successional pathways. So this is why you tend to find an unpredictability in the pattern of succession, right? So the history, meaning which seeds get there, and chance events, like was there a fire, what else happened, make it unpredictable. You can't predict exactly which species will be there at each stage. However, the kinds of traits and the interactions between species are predictable. You always start out with these little herbaceous things leading way to smaller shrubs, leading way to bigger trees, right? But you just can't predict like which herbaceous plants, which shrubs, and which trees. All right, so let's talk about some patterns in species richness. So species richness is the number of species present in a given community. So you can see here we have 3 communities. In community 1, we have 6 different species. Community 2, we have 6 species. In community 3, we only have 5. There are other ways of kind of calculating the number of species or the diversity of species that you have. And so we've done this a little bit with our iNaturalist project, but you can see that species diversity is a weighted measure that incorporates the relative abundance of a species into this measurement. So, all right, so let's look at community 1 and community 2. In community 1, you have like almost all the individuals in that community are species A, right, with only a few of everything else. So the species diversity is not awesome. But instead, in community 2, you tend to have a higher diversity, right? Because you can see here you have the same 6 species, but they're more evenly distributed. And then community 3, you can see we have fewer species, but they are also more evenly distributed. So you can see here the species diversity of community 3 is actually higher than community 1, even though community 3 has 5 species and community 1 has 6 species, right? Because there aren't very many of any of the other species except species A, over here. We can also measure evenness, which is just kind of a measurement of whether you tend to have similar numbers of species or different numbers of similar numbers of each species or different numbers. So for example, this is all over the place, the evenness is low, and both in community 2 and 3, we have about the same numbers of individuals of each species. All right, so let's talk about global patterns in species richness. So in the mid-1800s, biologists made the realization that the communities in the tropics have more species than communities in temperate or subarctic communities. So this is kind of a study looking at this, looking at the number of vascular plant species per 10,000 kilometers squared. And you find more vascular plant species at the equator than, for example, near the poles. And we can also see the strong latitudinal gradient in species diversity for communities, as well as lots of different taxonomic groups. All right, so hopefully in this chapter, you learned about complex and dynamic interactions among species. We talked about commensalism, competition, consumption, and mutualism, and how it plays into community structure. And we talked about how community structure changes over time, causing differences in community dynamic, specifically disturbance and succession. And we talked about how community structure can vary in terms of its species richness.